Hello, everybody. Welcome to Carpet City Cinema, a Gila Films podcast. And this is David Weaver. So, the other night I stopped by the office of Jay Leonard, producer of The Last Frankenstein, and he showed me the cut of the making of doc that's going to go on the upcoming Blu-ray. And big shout out to him for taking on that project. I was kind of concerned that if I did it, it would be a 10-year adventure before we ever finished, and we didn't have that luxury of time. And he did a great job of structuring all the footage into a solid narrative of how the film came about. So I think people are really going to be happy with that. He's going to also show me, I have to stop by his office again probably tomorrow night, and he's going to have a little structured together interview with Jared Baylog, the makeup artist, as a separate piece. Showing the process of designing and creating the two monsters in the film and the various effects. And then we have some footage, of course, from all the interviews we shot that didn't make it into these featurettes. And I think that what we'll probably do with that stuff is do some kind of digital rollout of those, take the footage we have left and create these little mini videos that we can put online as we get closer to the street date of the Blu-ray and DVD. And I think that would be a good way to kind of build momentum and anticipation towards the final street date. I'm just waiting on some spec details from the distributor before we can get all the files exported and the movie and get that all on a hard drive and shipped out to them. So we're at the last leg of this marathon to get this movie out on Blu-ray and DVD. So we're really exciting to have all that come together. I finished the outtakes reels just last night. I think it was yesterday. I finished bouncing out the sound and gonna show that to Jay tomorrow too. Over 20 minutes of outtakes, a lot of fun stuff, and just kind of good to look back at the film and from the perspective of like things that were happening on set, in between the takes, even if it's not just something like a blooper, it might just be kind of the interaction between the cast, and it's good to look back at that. It was really nice to watch that. So that's kind of like the big thing with Gila Films right now. Just waiting to hear back from the distributor, get that out, and then we can start announcing to everyone some more details on that. Had someone ask us on the Facebook page for the movie if we had any plans to attend the Chiller convention in New Jersey, and that kind of speaks to a broader issue, which is just that we'd love to go to conventions in general. We have no plans to go to Chiller because that's like in April. I think the next one they do a couple a year, but once the discs get out for the movie, then we actually have some merchandise that we can move at a convention. Definitely would be open to that. I'd love to kind of do screenings, not just at like conventions, but also be cool to kind of stop by some record stores, old school vinyl record stores, or kind of the throwback video stores that have been on the rise lately, and do little screenings and meet and greets and pop-up tables of merch. We'll see how that plays out after we get the discs in our hand, but it's definitely something that I've thought about, if we don't have any concrete plans right now. Of course, we're moving right along with this podcast. This is our 4th episode. And looking back at last week's poll that we posted with the episode, which, we talked about the passing of Michael Reeves last week, who was a screenwriter for pretty much every iconic 1980s and early 90s animated series ever made. And we asked which was your favorite of those that he wrote for. And the thing about the Spotify polls is they only give you 7 options. You have to pick 7 options. And the winner was Challenge of the GoBots was the one that topped out the other ones we could fit into the poll. GoBots was definitely, my jam in the 80s. For whatever reason, I never really got into Transformers. I don't know why that happened. It just must have been whatever my parents plopped me down for the TV, what was on. And Jay jokingly refers to GoBots as the Caldor version of Transformers. But I love him. Yeah, it's definitely a lot simpler in terms of the way those toys actually worked, and probably the audience base was it didn't have the vision that Transformers did in terms of trying to like kind of target older people too. Transformers was a little darker, I think, in content, somewhat. But I mean, that's 80s Hanna-Barbera GoBots, so you're talking about like Space Stars was coming out at that time, and of course on USA Cartoon Express you could watch reruns of stuff like Captain Caveman and the Hair Bear Bunch, and so it really fit in with all that. I had a whole bunch of GoBot toys when I was a kid in the coloring book, and I actually right now I have a 35 millimeter print of the movie GoBots Battle of the Rock Lords, which I think pretty much barely had a theatrical release. The actual show of the GoBots, that's all out on DVD. Basically all the Hanna-Barbera stuff pretty much is at Warner Brothers, at least from that era and before. But the movie, I don't know what's going on with that. I think it had a VHS release, but I think the problem with the movie is there's a rights conflict because I think the distributor of the movie, even though Hanna-Barbera produced it, the distributor, I think, is owned. That entity is now owned by a different company. It might even be MGM. So I don't know. I'd love to get that. It's up on YouTube. I'd love to be able to get my hands on a disc copy of that movie. And if I have to, I'll just pony up some money and transfer my print and have to be satisfied with that. When I'm living a life of a little more luxury, perhaps. Yeah, the interesting thing now, of course, is that now GoBots, the IP for that, the intellectual property for GoBots is now owned by Hasbro, I believe, which owns the Transformers too. So now it's just all rolled into one company. So it doesn't even exist anymore as its own entity. I think they tried to build like some kind of storyline about GoBots into the world of Transformers after they bought the IP for that. But yeah, it's gone now. Sad but true. Yeah, so that was the response to last week's poll. Had a phone conversation. Had a couple of phone conversations actually this last week with Alessandro De Gaetano, director of UFO Target Earth. Just kind of touching base with what he has going on. He's actually involved right now in a pre-production on a musical play that he's really passionate about, and that is going to bring him out. His work on that is actually going to bring him out closer to where I live. So we're kind of in talks about, eventually getting together in person at a time that will hopefully dovetail nicely with the transfer for that movie being done so we can get his commentary track. Sadly, some of the physical stuff he had regarding the movie in terms of like press kits and he had some design work for like a t-shirt and some it's just physical things like that, paraphernalia from the shooting of the movie that he had hoped that we could scan some of that stuff and do something with it. Unfortunately, it was stored at his sister's house, and he told me that she just had a fire at her house. And although she's okay and everything's all right, no one was hurt, house was fully insured, all that stuff, though, was lost, sadly. But, I guess as I've posted, from time to time, I pick up anything I can get my hands on related to UFO Target Earth. So we'll definitely, at least have that stuff, the different magazines and newspaper clippings and to put on there. Also, he told me, unfortunately, that one of his former creative partners passed away. He had just heard about it prior to our phone call. And that was Steve Gelman. And they go back to, Alessandro and Steve Gelman go back to at least to the mid-'90s. They might have known each other before that. But he was an associate producer on Project Metal Beast, which is, like I've mentioned before, is probably, it might be the best known film that Alessandro made, 1995 mixture of horror and sci-fi that Barry Bostwick and Kane Hodder were both in. And following that, they then collaborated on Butch Camp, which was the next movie that Alessandro directed, the comedy he did. And Gelman was a producer on that movie, whose leading lady, Judy Tenuta, also passed away not too long ago. And then lastly, at least in terms of finished release projects, was the movie Neowolf, which came out much later. That came out in 2010. And again, Steve Gelman was an associate producer on that. And Alessandro didn't direct that movie, but he did co-write the script. for that. So sad to hear that he died like I said in a car accident. Wasn't terribly old, but a tip of the hat to him for the work he did with Alessandro. And another person actually who passed away, I wanted to mention last week, I forgot, was Rick de Azevedo, who's better known actually probably more for his singing career than his career in front of the camera. And he was part of the rather voluminous King family, which is a very famous musical family, kind of built around a group of them known as the King Sisters, which there were 6 of them who kind of came and went at different times, different formations of what became known as the King Sisters Singing Act. And they were really popular during the World War II era, and after that, they eventually were even able to secure their own TV show, the King Family Show, in like 65 to 69 that ran. They did a whole bunch of holiday specials over the years. And one of the sisters, Alice King, Rick was her son from her first marriage. And he's very prominently featured in a lot of the holiday specials they have. Obviously, all the kids of the sisters, showed up in these specials. Even if they just were like tiny infants, they'd find a way to work them in. Very big family affairs. And had this really famous moment from one of the King family Christmas specials, where he had actually gone off to military service, and this was kind of during the Vietnam era. And while his mother was on stage singing "I'll Be Home for Christmas," he surprised her by coming onto stage. He had, come home on some type of leave or something without telling her. And of course, she just immediately, starts, crying while continuing to sing. It was a big moment, a big get you right there in your heartstrings moment. But interesting to fans of genre cinema, such as myself, Rick's father, Alice's first husband, Sidney de Azevedo, died when Rick was not even 6 years old yet. I tried to quickly check how he died. I'm not sure. And then Alice ended up remarrying to none other than Robert Clark, who is an actor who's very well known to fans of classic sci-fi and horror movies. He starred in The Man from Planet X, The Astounding She-Monster, Beyond the Time Barrier. He co-directed, produced, co-wrote, and starred in The Hideous Sun Demon, which is one I'm a big fan of. And he continued to work in those genre movies even after they got married. He didn't leave that. And he was in some films that were a little higher profile, still kind of on the B range, but some of Val Lewton's horror movies in the 40s, he had smaller roles in those, and continued to act throughout the years. Fred Olen Ray cast him in Alienator. Fred Olen Ray, the cult filmmaker who did that with a lot of the older actors. He found roles for them in his movies. He showed up on Kolchak and Murder, She Wrote. But obviously, because his background is acting, Robert Clark shows up in a lot of the holiday specials too, kind of like usually telling stories. That's kind of his thing. But I always found that interesting that he was part of that. And he and Alice had a son, Cam Clark, who's a very well-known voice actor. I mean, he voiced Leonardo and Rocksteady in the 80s Ninja Turtles animated series. He's voiced Liquid Snake in the Metal Gear video games. He's very well known, to people who are really big fans of animation and gaming. So that was Rick's half brother. So Rick did go on to do some work in television outside of the King family. He was a producer on some series throughout the late 70s and early 80s, the Private Benjamin TV show, Young Maverick, which is a reboot of the James Garner Western, Enos, I don't know how you pronounce that, the Dukes of Hazzard spinoff. And he also worked some other positions. He was a post-production exec at Universal, and also worked in charge of post-production at Warner Brothers Television. And also for Warner Brothers, he helped, he was involved kind of like overseeing their vault assets. He helped develop their organizational system for that. I'm a big fan, though, of the King family specials, much to my girlfriend's chagrin, and I'm sure I'll watch the Easter one later this week, which is one of my favorites. It's shot mostly at this, very much of its time, like shopping center. MVD Entertainment put out these 2 disc sets, which, 2 different sets, and each I think is 2 discs with many of the specials, classic specials from Christmas, Easter, Mother's Day, Thanksgiving, and they're just a lot of fun to watch. And, the Robert Clark connection obviously is cool because of my love for that kind of cinema that he was involved with. And also, I really they're very talented singers, and that kind of like the easy listening music of that time period of the '60s. I've always been a big fan of that too. So for someone like me who's a big fan of mid-century shtick in all its glory, the King family, I'm right at home there for sure. So, yeah, Rick de Azevedo died. He was 75 years old. Also passed away, just read about it this morning, was Maria Silva, who was an actress from Spain, whose career was probably defined to most modern audiences, again, by association with the horror genre and the kind of cult cinema genre. She showed up in a lot of European horror movies throughout the 60s and 70s. I mean, she continued to act past that, but a lot of ones that people are very familiar with. She did a couple movies with Paul Naschy, who's, like the definitive Spanish horror movie star. She was in The Mummy's Revenge and Curse of the Devil. She showed up in Tombs of the Blind Dead, the first of the Blind Dead movies, and Jess Franco's The Awful Dr. Orloff, and did some westerns as well. She was in a couple of the Zorro movies that Frank Lattimore made over in Europe in the 60s, and one of the Sartana movies. Ms. Silva was 81 years old. And last of these happy tidings of people we've lost, an actress who I'm a big fan of is the very lovely, very talented Sharon Acker, who is from Canada. She's a Canadian actress, and probably her most famous role is she played Lee Marvin's wife in the very classic 1967 neo-noir movie Point Blank, which younger audiences, though not super young, might know as based on the same novel that the Mel Gibson movie Payback was based on. And Ms. Acker, she also was in Don't Let the Angels Fall, which is a very critically acclaimed Canadian film. She showed up in Happy Birthday to Me, the Canadian slasher from the early 80s. Did a bunch of TV work. She was Della Street on the new Perry Mason, which was short-lived in the 70s. I'm really hoping someone will release that at some point, being the huge Perry Mason fan I am. But unfortunately, I think that's a Fox title, so probably ain't gonna happen. But she also starred on the short-lived show Executive Suite. She was also Hal Holbrook's wife on The Bold Ones, The Senator, which was a one-season show where Holbrook played the senator. But in terms of her small screen work, what really most people probably know her for is Star Trek. She guest starred on the third season episode of The Mark of Gideon, which is the one where Kirk's on a mission to deal with this overpopulated planet, and he goes to beam down to the planet and then finds himself still seemingly on the Enterprise, which is empty except for this young woman, which is Sharon Acker. And even though people give a lot of crap to the third season of Star Trek, that's a good episode. That's definitely, it's got some really nice eerie moments in it too. She also was in the TV movie from the 70s called The Stranger, a science fiction TV movie with Glenn Corbett, which was an attempt to launch a TV show that didn't work out. And a lot of people might be familiar with that movie because under its alternate title, Stranded in Space, it was riffed on Mystery Science Theater. So people might be familiar from her, about her from that too. And of course, she just guest starred on tons of the shows of that era. But yeah, really great actress, beautiful. She's actually also in one of my favorite Macmillan Wife episodes, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier about NBC mystery movies a week or two ago. It's a really great movie. A really great episode where she thinks her husband's come back from the dead, possibly. We watch it. My girlfriend and I watched that episode at Halloween. Cameron Mitchell's in it too. So yeah, a lot of fun there. And she showed up in Quincy as well, which we watch. So yeah, definitely R.I.P. to Ms. Acker. And she passed away at the age of 87. So also today, aside from Ms. Silva's passing, there was some good news though. Severin just announced their next batch of releases, Severin Films, the boutique physical media label, which specializes in genre films, and is also the namesake for a character in the last Frankenstein. The older emergency room intensive care doctor who, when they're trying to shock the old creature who's going into cardiac arrest, and he says, we're just going to ship this guy off to another hospital. played by actor Roger Kennedy. His character's name is Dr. Louis Severin. Not that they referred to by that. If you look closely, you'll see it on the badge and then credits. And that actually was uh, early on. When I wrote that script, this was it was quite a while ago when I actually wrote the script, and I had just become familiar with Severin. So it was neither a dig at Severin that the character was a jackass, nor was it trying to like be all like check this out, wink wink, Easter egg. It was really just I was trying to think of a name for the character, and I just kind of become familiar with Severin, and I just thought, oh, okay, that sounds like a good last name, works for me. Then again, maybe when I sent a screener to them to check it out, maybe that's why they didn't want the movie. They thought I was trying to compare their label with an asshole emergency room doctor. Not true. Not true at all. I love Severin. I have tons of their movies. They are like true heroes to me. They do a lot of great Canadian cinema. I mean, they do all kinds of films, European, American, everything, but they've definitely put the spotlight on some Canadian films I love. Obviously, they did the Al Adamson box set, um, which, that's the cult movie director that Bob Dix was so associated with. And they made the documentary about Al Adamson, which Bob was interviewed for not too long before his passing. But yeah, so today they announced their April slate, and a couple titles really stood out among them. The first was a movie called Alien from the Abyss from 1989, which sounds like a lot of fun. I never even heard of this movie. It was directed by Antonio Margheriti, who's a really famous Italian genre director. He did a slew of science fiction space movies in the early mid 60s, like Battle of the Worlds with Claude Rains and The Snow Devils. He did some gothic horror movies that are very well regarded, such as Castle of Blood with Barbara Steele and The Web of the Spider with Anthony Franciosa, who an actor I love. Did a veteran of the genre. And this is later in his career that this came out, and it stars Charles Napier, who was in so many Jonathan Demme movies and the Blues Brothers, and um, of course Demme's Silence of the Lambs. He's one of the CO guards who Hannibal Lecter kills, and the movie revolves around one of those wicked giant corporations dumping toxic waste into a volcano, following which a creature emerges. And Severin's got up one of their trailers. I love the trailers that they edit together. Um, you check it out on their Facebook page just for the movie. It looks a lot of fun. The movie's also known as Alien from the Deep. And the other one that they announced today that really caught my eye is finally on Blu-ray, the 1983 E.T. ripoff, Extraterrestrial Visitors, which most people know by its title Pod People, because it was famously riffed by Mystery Science Theater, probably one of their more famous episodes. Hilarious. It was when I'd seen Mystery Science Theater when it initially aired a couple times, but really didn't get back into it until I was at the local video store, local Blockbuster, and they had for sale a used VHS tape of the Pod People episode. And I bought that, and that's what totally kicked off my getting back into Mystery Science Theater, and became contagious. My uncle got into it, and my sister. And I had this movie, the actual unriffed version, on one of those 50 movie sets from Mill Creek put out. So it'll be quite something to see this released in high definition glory. And Severin has also recreated the I'm a Virgin, the famous I'm a Virgin V-neck white shirt that the one character in the recording studio wears. You can buy that, as well as they've created a plush Trumpy doll too, which is pretty wild. Yeah, and so the fact that this is now going to be like a 4K scan from the negative, that's amazing, because that Milk Creek DVD obviously was just like a VHS rip or something. And the release is also going to come with a feature length doc on the director, which I should mention that the Alien from the Abyss is also going to have a feature length doc on its director, Antonio Margheriti. But Extraterrestrial Visitors was directed by Juan Piquer Simon, who very famous within genre films. Pieces, of course, is his classic, the famous slasher film. It's a terrific movie. But he also did films like Slugs and Where Time Began. So there's going to be a feature-length doc on him included in this release. So that's definitely really cool. Glad to see that. And Kino Lorber just announced the titles on Volume 3 of their Audie Murphy collections. I think we talked about Volume 2 the other week. And these ones on this set are all from the 60s. And it will include Showdown, which I have not seen. It's the only one on the set I haven't seen before, so that would be pretty cool to check that out. Hellbent for Leather, which is, it's an all right film he did. He plays a guy mistaken for a killer, a case of mistaken identity, and he's trying to track down the real bad guy, the real villain. And the last one is Posse from Hell, which is a really solid one. I'm really glad they put that in the set. That has Murphy leading up the titular posse after a group of criminals terrorize this small town, and the criminals include Vic Morrow and, of course, Lee Van Cleef. And they kill the sheriff and they take a girl hostage, and so Murphy's got to lead this ragtag group of citizens to go out after these criminals, and it includes John Saxon and Paul Carr, who is a character actor I'm a big fan of, and so they go on the hunt for these criminals, and that's definitely one of Murphy's, of the ones I've seen from the '60s, one of his stronger outings. That and 7 Ways from Sundown. I'm hoping they'll get to that one eventually too, because that's another really good one he did at Universal in the '60s. So they don't have a street date yet on this, but it is on its way. And I think that about covers it for kind of the new releases that really stood out to me this past week. So last night, I was in the mood for something 80s to watch, and finally, after taking way too long to select a movie, decided to go with a film from 1987, which I had never seen before, called Malone with Burt Reynolds. And this is from the declining part of Burt Reynolds' career as a superstar, as a film star. You look back at his kind of the trajectory of his career, and he really had quite the journey. Guest starring on TV shows and kind of leading some lower budgeted movies like Operation CIA, and or playing second fiddle to like Jim Brown and 100 Rifles. He had a couple of his own shows there too, like Dan August and Hawk, and obviously was on Gunsmoke for a while. And it really wasn't until Deliverance, which was 72, came out, that he really started to see this, definite elevation in his career status. And it was right around that time too that he got attention because he was dating Dinah Shore, and also he did the posed nude in Cosmopolitan. And over the next few years, it was just kind of this slow ascendancy. He had The Longest Yard, he did White Lightning, he had a couple films in there that didn't do so well, but still, it was all, it was this upward movement in his career that really then, shot off even to higher heights when Smoking the Bandit came out, because that movie was huge. It was the second highest grossing movie of 1977 after, of course, Star Wars, and had a budget of like $4 million, and took in something like $300 million. That film was massive. And also, on another note, kind of rejuvenated Jackie Gleason's career, who, I'm a big fan of The Great One. And, for the next, like 5-ish years, he was doing great. His films were really knocking it out of the park in terms of box office returns. Even if he had ones that didn't do Smoking the Bandit level business, they still did good business. He had movies coming out, like obviously the sequel to Smoking the Bandit and the Cannonball Run, which were kind of the same ilk. But he also did the End, which was the comedy he did with Don DeLuise that he also directed. He kind of gets associated with that kind of good old boy car crash genre, but he was also doing stuff like Starting Over, which got some Oscar nominations, and Paternity and Best Friends, and even some of those they did it all right. They made a little bit of money there, even when he kind of ventured outside of what was the comfort zone for his audience. But he was he was huge. He was like one of the biggest, stars out of Hollywood at that time. And then it was really, he even says it himself, it was really around '83 when he did Stroker Ace, which was yet another collaboration car crash 'em up collaboration with director Hal Needham, who had worked with him on, Smoking the Bandit 1 and 2 and the Cannonball Run and another movie they had done together called Hooper, which had been very successful back in 1978. And, you know, this was a film where Reynolds said that that's where he lost his fans was Stroker Ace. And the kind of the depending on how you look at it, sad, is that he turned down the role that went to Jack Nicholson in terms of endearment to make Stroker Ace, which he did as he felt he kind of like obligated to as a favor to Needham, because Needham had been so instrumental in his career taking off, and the movie didn't even make back its budget, and so you look at what happens after Stroker Ace. That's the thing, you can have a flop, even a huge flop, a monumental flop, and it's really about what you do after that. Do you just, do you freak out and start taking every role that comes your way? Do you really do, or do you really take kind of take an awareness of why the movie bombed? Is it a good movie that just wasn't appreciated at the time? I mean, that happens too. You look at people like, obviously, people always talk about Ishtar. That's kind of one of those catch-all movies that people refer to when they're talking about flops. And Ishtar is a film that has gone on actually to have a reevaluation. Is considered quite by many people to be a good movie, and just kind of something that wasn't understood at the time, and it was actually kind of sabotaged by the head of the studio or the studio powers. But as big as a reputation as that film has for being a flop, Dustin Hoffman, he still went on and won the Oscar for Rain Man after that, just a few years after that. Warren Beatty still had Bugsy and Dick Tracy coming up. And so, you don't have to be defined by a film that bombs. But, the issue with Reynolds is it was just like the stuff that came after that, it was like one after the other that just didn't really perform well. I mean, you're looking at movies like, Stick, or Heat, or City Heat, which was a different film with Eastwood that definitely didn't live up to expectations and had a troubled production. I think the most successful film of this time period before Malone came out would probably have been Cannonball Run 2, which is just kind of like going back to the car crash 'em up well. Yeah, a lot of these films, like I said, they had troubled productions. I mean, City Heat. It had like a $25 million budget. It made like just shy of $40 million, but when you figure in marketing, there probably wasn't any profit left there. That was a movie that was originally supposed to have been made by Blake Edwards. It was a gangster movie with Burt Reynolds and Clint Eastwood, and then Reynolds was seriously injured in the making of that. They did the other movie I mentioned, Heat, from 1986, is one that was originally supposed to have been directed by the great Robert Altman. And then, Altman ended up pulling out, and then Dick Richards came aboard, and he and Reynolds didn't get along. In fact, Reynolds actually, famously punched him. And, some of the film had to be overseen by another director. So, this wasn't like a great time in Reynolds' career when you're looking at what was coming out. Even if you like these movies, some of these movies might, that's not a diss on the actual quality of the finished product, but they were troubled productions that were not connecting with audiences. They were not connecting with critics. And, Malone is kind of like one of the last nails in the coffin, because Malone came out in 87. And, pretty much, what Burt Reynolds did after that, the next ones he did after that were Rent-A-Cop, Switching Channels, and Physical Evidence. Rent-A-Cop didn't even make $1 million. And Switching Channels, it's kind of a taste of what Reynolds kind of switching over to a little bit more character actor work. That was a remake of the famous newspaper comedy play The Front Page, which had already been adapted as His Girl Friday, and it didn't do well at the box office either. And then Physical Evidence, which was a Michael Crichton movie, that also just bombed out. And that's really when Reynolds switched over to kind of consciously, I think, to more character work with Breaking In, the Bill Forsyth movie that came out in 1989. But even though he got some good reviews for that, it just, again, it didn't really do well enough at the box office to kind of turn things around. And I mean, I would say that's really, I think if you look at, unless you want to count All Dogs Go to Heaven, that's an animated film. Um, it's really 1989. It's the last movie last year, I think, where he's really he has a chance to kind of turn the tide around, and it doesn't happen. Because then, you look at after that, it's his next leading role in a theatrical film is Cop and a Half after 1989. Because after he does All Dogs Go to Heaven, which is a voice, then he does a supporting role in a movie Robbie Benson directed called Modern Love. He does a cameo in The Player, and then in '93 he does Cop and a Half, which of course is just you know uh, highly disliked film. His attempt at kind of like to approach kind of like the more kid friendly market, and yeah. So, but back to Malone. This was a film. It was adapted from a book called Shotgun, a novel called Shotgun by William P. Wingate. And so the plot of the film is Burt Reynolds plays obviously a guy named Malone, Richard Malone, which maybe just be an alias. He's a CIA operative who is basically done with it. He's done with like having to carry out assassinations and done with just the work of the agency, and just decides to leave it all behind. And there's they really kind of go through this quickly at the beginning of the film. His fellow CIA agent is played by Lauren Hutton, and he's just like I'm out. And there's of course the contractually required line in any CIA movie about how you can never really get out. But then we go to Reynolds driving his Mustang out in Oregon, and the car breaks down. Fortunately, not too far from a gas and repair station owned by Scott Wilson, the great character actor Scott Wilson, and he's there with his daughter, his daughter Jo, played by Cynthia Gibb, and Reynolds has to find himself to stay in this area for a little while he's waiting for the car to be repaired, because they have to call him for parts. And he finds out that this kind of very open, very wide open rural area, that there is trouble between the people who live there and a very rich person named Charles Delaney, played by Cliff Robertson, the Academy Award-winning actor. And Delaney is going around basically buying up everybody's land, and if people aren't really interested in selling it to him, he has no problem with using violence to get his way. And what the people don't realize why he's doing this is he's really like this heading up this ultra right-wing conservative racist organization, which is basically trying to build these communities in different parts of the country, these fortresses of freedom, as Robertson refers to it later on in the film, where they can have a base of operations, where they can build arsenals of weapons, as they carry out their vision to basically make America to the country they want. And they've got politicians starting to get politicians into their hands. They've got a senator in their pocket. They've got the local sheriff in their pocket. And like I said, they have no problem using violence. There's a scene where just for the sake of making sure we know what we're dealing with, they send a hired assassin to go kill the leader of like a black community activism organization, kind of like an NAACP. So yeah, and Reynolds finds himself in the middle of this conflict, because this land that Scott Wilson is on, that his station is on, Cliff Robertson wants that land, and Scott Wilson doesn't want to sell. And there's also kind of like, as the subplot to everything going on, is that Lauren Hutton is ordered by the CIA to go to Burt Reynolds, go to Malone, and to kill him, because he was in the CIA, he knows too much, that whole thing. So Reynolds, of course, in classic '80s action movie fashion, as the threat becomes more dangerous to Scott Wilson and Cynthia Gibbs, one of their neighbors is murdered. She's the daughter's harassed. Cynthia Gibbs is harassed by the local Cretans who are working for Delaney. Reynolds starts having to use his special set of skills. I guess this would probably be a Liam Neeson movie, 20 years later or something like that, 25 years later. But yeah, he has to resort back to his CIA skills and weaponry to start kicking ass. Yeah, the film, I was never bored. So there's that. I was never bored. And, a lot of, I think there's a lot of people kind of look at this movie as basically a ripoff of Shane, the very famous 1953 Western about, Alan Ladd plays a gunslinger who, rides into this community where he befriends a farming family and finds himself in the middle of a conflict between the farmers and the ranchers. Um, and so this movie, kind of even Reynolds himself seemed to be aware of this. There was an interview he gave, and he said, and this is a quote from him. He says, "I was attracted to Malone because I thought there was a chance the movie might be more than a guy running away from his past. Let's be honest, the film is Shane. I am an ex-CIA man whose car breaks down in a small town, who then gets close to a family and attempts to battle a Lyndon LaRouche character played by Cliff Robertson. I'm not doing Clint in Pale Rider. There's a little bit of Stallone from First Blood in this, but I'm not playing the damaged goods guy Sly became in Rambo." So yeah, I mean, even Reynolds was aware, I think, of the similarities between that film and Shane. I mean, Shane's a classic. Shane's one of those movies that it deserves its classic reputation. I mean, the problem with Malone is it's just, it kind of just goes through the beats. It goes through the paces very mechanically of, an action revenge movie. You take this guy who's, you identify him as having like, these obviously very dangerous skills and weaponry and hand-to-hand combat, and then stick him in this, in this situation where it's the classic person he has to stand up for. It's a small business owner who, on top of that, walks with a limp. Scott Wilson's character walks with a limp. He's got a bad leg. Who's got his wife's dead. He's got this innocent teenage daughter. And then, on the other side of things, it's villains out of comic books, out of cartoons. Two of the main heavies that keep going after Reynolds and the family at the beginning of the film. And they're brothers. One of them played by Tracy Walter, who was Bob the Goon in Batman. I mean, they're very they're every inch of the definitive redneck villain. Talking with which I don't know what they're doing up in Oregon, but they look like they haven't bathed in forever. They look like Larry, Daryl, and Daryl kind of a thing. The one weighs like 300 pounds, and they're just making vulgar threats about what they'd like to do to the daughter, and the film just kind of takes the very basic connect the dots approach to creating the situation, creating the characters who will be antagonists to Malone. It doesn't really bring too much new or invigorating to what is a very basic and a very time-worn premise. It wastes no time in getting into it. I'll say that, it doesn't really, spend a lot of time building up. Maybe it should have. Maybe that would have made it better. I don't know. If they had built any kind of more of an introduction to get us deeper into Burt Reynolds' mindset or his life prior to arriving into this Oregon community. The problem then was been like, the same people writing that setup was the same people who were writing the rest of the movie. So I think you just would have ended up with a setup that was kind of like really not that interesting. It was just more of kind of like paint by numbers storytelling. So I think they, probably in the end, we were spared that. I mean, it's a good cast, but they just don't really have much to do. I mean, Kenneth McMillan, a great character actor, he plays the sheriff in the town, who's kind of, does whatever Cliff Robertson tells him to do. And I love McMillan. He's great in films like Salem's Lot, and where he was the sheriff in that, and Taking of Pelham 123. And Scott Wilson, like I said, terrific actor. Cynthia Gibbs, she kind of probably stands out the most, actually. She was on the TV show Fame back in the day before this came out. She played Karen Carpenter in the Karen Carpenter Story, the TV movie, and she, I think she kind of pops out the most, which isn't a diss against anybody else's performances. I just think that she's probably she comes with the most freshness to the film. I mean, Reynolds is good in it. Reynolds isn't bad. It's not like he gives a bad performance. I was reading some reviews on the movie and talking about how he just kind of like, it's like he's walking in his sleep. And I don't think so. I think he brings to the character what the script calls for. The problem is the script's not calling for much. You can't fault someone, and that goes for all of them. That goes for McMillan and Scott Wilson and Lauren Hutton. They're giving what the script requires of them. It's not requiring much. It's a very rudimentarily established revenge film. We're going to make our villains, very bad. They're going to look like they're very bad. They're going to sound like they're very bad. It's going to be right out of a comic book or a cartoon show. And we're going to make our protagonist someone who, of course he worked for a government agency, and of course he has weapons, this amazing handgun, and drives a Mustang, and so we know he's going to be like badass, and we're going to put them in this, situation that's squeezing the little guy, because who wants to root against the little guy? So someone that the audience will identify with. It's very, very numbers crunching kind of approach to filmmaking. But what you get from that is something that's just never invigorates really. Yeah, like I said, it's not boring because it's this is like a 90-minute movie. It gets right into the conflict pretty quickly. It's always got something going on with the action beats, and even between them, you're watching, like I said, Scott Wilson or Cynthia Gibb. You're watching these talented players, but you're never you never walk away from it thinking that you've watched anything really exceptional. It does feature probably the worst hairpiece Burt Reynolds ever wore. I mean, it's really bad. But the film, they talk about it having echoes of Shane, and it, like I said, it does. It's kind of that same that same basic concept. Unstoppable, super badass guy. Saves the little man from the evil corporation or rancher, whichever it is, which based on the film you're watching. But it also kind of reminds me, even though it hadn't come out yet, is a Roadhouse. It kind of reminds me a little bit of that, which Roadhouse is a great film, because Roadhouse, the thing about Roadhouse is it had a style to it, that really, such a definitively 80s style, shot by Dean Cundy with the great neon lighting. And, that's an example of kind of like this basic general concept around the same time being the right way to do it, a really great way of doing it. And I think obviously, again, just this narrative is something that's very, very often used. So it's Walking Tall is kind of like this, right? The Joe Don Baker movie. A guy returning to his hometown to take on the criminals at large. The criminals in this one, though, they're really stupid too, though. I mean, that again, when you have, there's no sense of like, the stupidity you see from the criminals in this movie is such that it kind of eviscerates like believability. And if the whole movie had a tone of kind of like over the top kind of, action and stylistic approach, then that wouldn't really necessarily be a problem. But the film takes a somewhat grounded approach to things. It's not trying to turn Burt Reynolds' character into necessarily a superhero. So when you're seeing the bad guys just engage in idiotic behavior they wouldn't do, then it kind of takes away from you perceiving them as a threat, you as the viewer. Even just the fact that even the most basic kernel of the story, which is that as events unfold, Cliff Robertson's character wants Burt Reynolds eliminated. Even that's hard to swallow because the way things start to escalate basically is Reynolds is stuck in a small town. He's with the family waiting for his car to get fixed. He witnesses a neighbor murdered in a deliberately staged car accident. A neighbor who wouldn't sell out to Cliff Robertson's character. Still, not much comes of that incident to really escalate things. But then what happens is that Burt Reynolds is walking along the road with Cynthia Gibb, Scott Wilson's teenage daughter, and one of the goons, truckload of goons drives by, and one of them starts, sexually harassing her. And of course, this, turns into the classic standoff where Reynolds kicks the guy's ass. And, from there, it's like Cliff Robertson's basically like, I want to find out about this guy, and I'm willing to do anything I'm willing to do anything to find out about this guy. I'm willing to escalate things, escalate the violence to get an idea of who this guy is and what he wants around here. He basically like really overreacts. Like if this guy was really a super successful head of, some right wing group that, has cells in all parts of the country and has senators in their pockets and has all this power. Think of someone like a Steve Bannon, but with like a militaristic vision. I don't think he'd really care if one of his guys got, who is even he would realize was acting like a jackass, got his ass kicked. I don't think he'd be like, oh man, I need to find out who this guy is who just kicked my guy's ass. Because they really start escalating things after that. The way they handle that whole situation is, this guy who gets beat up, his brother's another one of their goons, Tracy Walter's character. They basically like, oh, let's, we'll egg him on since his brother just got beat up. We'll egg him on to take revenge on Burt Reynolds, and we'll see what happens. We'll just see how that plays out, and they'll give us kind of like an idea of what Burt Reynolds' character's like. And it's just like, it just becomes like almost like obsessive, but on a really unrealistic level. Cliff Robertson's behavior and just wanting to like eliminate the what he perceives as a threat from Burt Reynolds, even though really Burt Reynolds really isn't doing too much at that point. I mean, he's really going out there. I mean, Robertson starts even calling out like hired guns from across the country and stuff. So it really, it just, again, it's just kind of like hard to take your villains seriously when they're acting in ways that really don't even fit the logic of the story that the story puts forth. And the whole subplot about like the CIA wanting to take Burt Reynolds out. I mean, that's just like, who cares? It really is just an excuse to get Hutton back in the picture so that you can have this kind of like, this leading, have a leading lady, have a romantic partner for Reynolds. Not really so much to develop romance, not because they're like, oh, we got to get the, the female audience or anything like that. But, without giving spoilers, they want to bring her back into the story later on, so as to kind of give some more motivation to Burt Reynolds' character. But that's really all it's there for, It's just kind of like, let's have this subplot just to fill basic story mechanics to move the story forward later on without it really being interesting or even necessary. Because it really doesn't matter that the CIA, by the time the film's done, it really doesn't matter whether or not the CIA wants Reynolds dead. It really has no bearing on the plot whatsoever. They could have found any reason to just have Hutton cross paths with Burt Reynolds. I mean, she could have just missed him. Something more basic and fundamental to kind of bring them back together later in the film. I'm not as a filmmaker who has made one movie and it's not exactly the most widely movie I've ever seen. I definitely don't want to sound like judgmental, but it's just kind of like lazy filmmaking though. Yeah, to just kind of like, have that kind of that subplot there. And again, you got these villains, they're like, this organization that Robertson runs, it's got all these like hired guns that can either get into contact with or that are part of this organization. And, it's the classic, they're always walking around in suits and ties and taking out people in the middle of the day. Yeah, I get that the local sheriff is under Cliff Robertson's powerful grasp, but I mean, there's the scene where, like I was talking about before, the scene where the quasi NAACP guy gets taken out. This guy just hired gun, suit and tie, walks into his office in a high-rise skyscraper in the middle of the day and just kills him, shoots him dead. But of course, he's got a silencer on the gun, but I think that'd be a little, and then just immediately then goes back to Cliff Robertson's like, yeah, it's all taken care of. Don't worry about it. I mean, and there's more than one scene like that where that kind of thing happens where it's, it's just all out in the open that these guys are killing people and, have nothing but mayhem and mischief in mind. And if your whole film has some kind of, again, over the top tone like that, then that might work. But when when that's not what's going on in your film, when your style is, and these parts will be grounded, will, have Reynolds be injured and actually spend time with him trying to recover. But when the villains are kind of like, something out of like a Hanna-Barbera Saturday morning cartoon, that kind of unevenness definitely, it's a weakness. It's a weakness in the film. But I'll say it again. I wasn't bored. And definitely kudos to the music score by David Newman, who's part of the Newman family. Alfred Newman and Randy Newman, Thomas Newman. Not that the score necessarily in its entirety is anything that you're like, oh wow, that was something I really walked away from. In my mind, it's sticking in my mind. But there are definitely some really good tracks. It's always serviceable score, but there are some really good tracks throughout. I think like the end titles track was really good. There are a couple others throughout the film. I was kind of curious if they ever released the soundtrack, but I couldn't find it. At least no one had uploaded it to YouTube if there was ever an album, which I tend to doubt. The film was directed by Harley Cokeless, who his career goes back to the 70s. He directed Black Moon Rising prior to this. That was the film he did right before this one, and that's the kind of as a cult following, the Tommy Lee Jones movie about the super futuristic Link car. And before that, actually, the film he had done right before that was for Roger Corman, which everybody has to pass through Roger Corman's offices at some point. He did for Corman a movie called Battle Truck. And Cokeless had shot Second Unit on Empire Strikes Back. So, he definitely, an experienced filmmaker. And like I said, he definitely keeps things moving so that, again, it's not a movie that you get up from watching and you're like, oh, that was, a waste of my time. You don't regret it because at least it kept you interested. It kept you interested enough to keep watching it. But at the same time, he's not really. He doesn't end up bringing anything. He's not able to bring anything to the film to move it past the problems, the fatal flaws of the screenplay. And in addition to that, it's not the really. Which, do you want to look at this as, it depends who the director is. Do you want to look at this as an issue with the director or an issue with the cinematographer? I tend to look at more as in the director's wheelhouse. It's a film that's really not the most visually pleasing. It was shot up in Canada, which that's not the issue. I love Canada. But it was shot in this very wide open, like I said, very, area with mountains and open fields. And interestingly, they didn't shoot it in scope, which, you would think you'd want to do that for a film like that. And there are definitely times where, like, the framing of the film, it just seems kind of tight. It seems like it's kind of too small. Like, I definitely feel like this is a film that really would have benefited from shooting in, like, that 2:3:5 ratio. I mean, you can make the argument that, the film takes place in a big area, but it's really about this small conflict between, Reynolds and Robertson. But I think that if they had shot this in a wider aspect ratio, that definitely would have helped. And just like the film, just like the color palette's kind of bland, if you're looking in terms of things like, wardrobes and locations and, all the various things that, have this cumulative effect on a film's visual punch, it's really, to me, it's really lacking in that area. I think it comes to life strongest, really in the climax between Reynolds and Robertson in this kind of like in this kind of computer bunker that Robertson has set up, where he's got like the computer systems that kind of oversee all his machinations, and it's shot in shadow and underlit, and that's probably where I think the film has its best moments, but it's it's brief, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean that's the thing. Actually, I think the film's final, by the time when that's really the culmination of the conflict when Reynolds and Robertson spar off in that location. From there until the end of the film, it's not like a huge running time, but that's probably the film's best moments because the music is it's best visually. Um, yeah, yeah. So I think that's where the film kind of really comes alive or comes closest to it. Um, and so this film, it was released by Orion Pictures, 1987. It had a budget of around $10 million, but unfortunately only made a little over 3 million. So just a big disaster. It didn't really hit off with the critics. And like I said, Reynolds' next leading films after this, met similar fates. He would find success on the small screen though, for a while there. With Evening Shade, which definitely, gave him a boost. Won him a Golden Globe and an Emmy for that show. But in terms of like being that feature film career, um, as like when you think of a traditional movie star, this was kind of coming. That was kind of coming to the end for him. And even like Evening Shade, like I said, that's a show that was successful in its time. It was popular, and Reynolds got the accolades and was on for 4 seasons, but really didn't do anything once it ran its course. After the show came to an end, it just didn't end up being something that Reynolds was able to parlay into returning to like the success he had before. Yeah, he did Boogie Nights, obviously, was nominated for the Oscar for that in '97. But really, if you look at the totality of his filmography, that's kind of like the exception, not the rule. And a film that, of course, Reynolds himself, Boogie Nights, had kind of a tempestuous relationship with that film itself. So, but I like Reynolds. I like him. I'm a big fan of like The Longest Yard, the original. Deliverance, is one of my, it's definitely a top film for me. He was a very gifted actor. He had a very good physical presence. So and even with this kind of like these, later misfires, some of which some of these films that throughout the '80s kind of didn't do well for him. They do have their own kind of cult following. He still left behind a great body of work. So. I watched this off the Kino Lorber Blu-ray. They put this out a few years ago. No extras on it except for like some trailers. But again, I think this was kind of like from an era. Like I think if they put this out now, they would. I think they definitely put some extras on. This was just kind of like more in the earlier era of Kino Lorber, kind of like we talked about with A Kiss Before Dying, where sometimes they were just kind of finding their way and taking the transfers that were given to them and not always having extras. But it is going out of print now, I believe. It might actually have gone out of print. So it's an MGM title. MGM's always willing to play ball. So it'll be interesting to see if maybe Kino will tackle this title again at some point. Relicense it, and maybe a new transfer would be nice. It definitely is an older master that was used. You could even see it right from the beginning. There was some like damage to the film and stuff. So it'd definitely be something that I would definitely revisit this at some point, especially if it had a new transfer. If it'd be interesting to kind of watch. I think with Reynolds' career, it'd be interesting to kind of watch these films in order. Especially if you start off like from Smoking the Bandit, really, really identify that time period where he went from being star to superstar, 5-year span, and then the next like 6 years, it's just this decline. It'd be really interesting to watch all those movies that he was the lead in order and just kind of like digest what was going on. Do you see a decline in his performances? Do you see declines in the quality of the films? Is it changes in audience tastes? What is it? But yeah, I think that'd be worth trying sometime. All right then. Well, I think that is enough for this episode of Carpet City Cinema. Thank you again for listening and for your support. Again, just keep spreading news about the podcast. Follow us on the Facebook, and then of course like on Twitter and Instagram. We're just on the Gila Films handles. And if you have any questions for us about The Last Frankenstein or Gila Films, anything you want talked about with that in regards to that on the podcast, feel free to shoot us an email to Carpet City Cinema, one word, at gila-film.com. All right, thanks a lot, and have a good week.